Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. The Brexit campaign has asked the BBC to do one pretty small favour for it in the run-up to the EU referendum, which is to differentiate between Europe and the EU. To encourage its reporters only to say Europe when they're referring to the continent of Europe, and to say the EU when they're referring to the Brussels-run union of 28 member states. And the BBC has refused, or it has at least failed to clarify these two very different terms and when they may be used by its staff. And this means, I think, that the BBC has implicitly given its nod of approval to its reporters to say Europe when they really mean the EU. And some observers think that the Brexit lobby is basically mad for asking for this reporting clarification from the BBC. So a writer for the New Statesman said it showed that some people will find bias in the most innocuous of things. In other words, chill out. It is not a problem that the national broadcaster interchangeably uses the terms Europe and the EU. Stop making a fuss about nothing, you Europhobic idiots. That's the message coming from most of the media and pretty much from the BBC. But I think the BBC's unwillingness to maintain or enforce a distinction between the phrase Europe and the phrase the EU is actually really revealing, really important, and extremely worrying. Because I think it speaks to one of the worst aspects of the debate about the EU at the moment, which is this conflation of the Brussels-based oligarchy called the EU with the continent of Europe. This depiction of the small, unaccountable cliques who peer down at Europe from their air-conditioned towers in Brussels with Europe itself. Think about some of the phrases that could potentially be used by BBC reporters if they use Europe to mean when they mean EU. They could say, for example, that the people of Peterborough, which is one of the most anti-EU parts of Britain, God bless them, they could say that those people are against Europe. They could say that the people of Warrington, which is the 7th most Eurosceptic part of Britain, they could say that those people hate Europe or are voting to get out of Europe. But of course they're doing no such thing. Britain isn't leaving the continent of Europe. That's not possible. That isn't what we're voting on. And these people in Peterborough and Warrington and across Britain might actually love Europe. Many of them probably do. They might holiday in Spain, they might have friends in France, they might love Swedish TV dramas, as everyone does these days. Many, if not most of them, won't be anti-European at all. They're just anti-EU. So the Stay campaign's habit of conflating Europe and the EU, what it really means is that those who are anti-EU can be easily depicted as being anti-Europe, as being xenophobic, as being nationalistic. These people's political outlook, i.e. their dislike of the fact that Brussels can impose its writ on nation states, their political outlook is reduced to a prejudiced outlook, a simple case of being anti-Europe. Their politics is pathologized. It's turned from opposition to a political system into opposition to a whole continent, and more importantly, to its people and its cultures. This is why we so often see the term Europhobic, which is literally my least favorite word in the English language. Because this term explicitly pathologizes people's dislike or opposition to the EU. It treats it almost as a mental illness. A phobia is an irrational fear. The Guardian recently said that ordinary people's Europhobia is being pandered to and fed by Tory leaders. In other words, there is a fearful, irrational mob out there, and the Tories are recklessly stirring us up. This week, a writer for New Europe magazine listed Europhobia alongside xenophobia, nationalism, Islamophobia, and racism as values that are, he says, alien to our post-war European culture. So you can see how casually criticism of the EU, political opposition to the Brussels oligarchy, is reduced to a phobia, an ism, something that goes against the ideals of Europe itself. And I think we really must challenge this really cynical conflation of Europe and the EU. And we must challenge the pathologization of the critics of Brussels as phobic or dumb or racist. Because to my mind, the EU and Europe are not even remotely the same thing. Actually, I'd go further and say that the EU actually grates against everything that is brilliant about Europe. The EU is an ugly, illiberal, undemocratic blot on the wonderful continent of Europe. The EU is a stain on the best, most inspiring values of Europe and of the peoples of Europe. It is the EU that is anti-Europe. I love Europe, but I hate the EU. I consider myself a European. I don't have any special emotional attachment to Great Britain. When I hear other Brexit campaigners saying, oh, Britain is so great, we can do everything on our own, I feel like giving them a slap. I mean, I love London, but I'm kind of Irish, and if I could afford it, I would live in Paris. So for me, this is not about defending some idea of the fantastic nature of Great Britain against Europe. My argument for getting out of the EU is not a little Englander one. It is not because I think Britain is the best country in the continent. I don't think it is. Sorry. It's not because I love the pound and the Queen. I don't love the Queen. I can't wait for her to go, and we can turn Buckingham Palace into a people's museum. I'm against the EU because the EU is detrimental to the whole of Europe, and particularly to two really important values that European peoples have been fighting for tooth and nail for hundreds of years: democracy and liberty. The EU is anti-democratic and illiberal, and that is why we must leave. Supporters of the EU tell us it is this kind of happy-clappy union of European peoples. That's nonsense. It is a union of European elites who want to avoid their peoples. The EU is fundamentally the mechanism through which national governments outsource various powers and decision-making processes to distant, aloof, mostly unaccountable bodies, like the European Commission, like the European Court of Justice, and so on. The real instinct behind the Brussels machine, the whole Brussels oligarchy, is not to bring Europe together. It is to absolve national governments of the pesky burden of having to consult us, the plebs, about important political and social matters, in favour of allowing various experts and cliques in Brussels to discuss and determine those matters on our behalf. The EU's fuel, its real fuel, is not cosmopolitanism, it is the desire to avoid democracy. From the outset, right from the very beginning, the EU has not been the embodiment of the European people's will. It has been a struggle against the European people's will. The 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which brought the EU as we know it into being, was only just approved by France. It was rejected by Denmark. And of course, it was not put to a referendum at all in Britain. British people were co-opted into the EU without our explicit consent. Almost every time they have been asked to give their verdict on the EU, the people of Europe have said, we don't want it. In Ireland in 2001, voters said no to the Nice Treaty. In 2005, the new EU constitution was rejected by voters in France and Holland by a pretty significant majority of voters. EU bureaucrats then denounced the French and Dutch as ignorant and pissed off. One MEP said it was mad to subject something as important as the EU's constitution to what he called the lottery of public opinion. The European Commission responded to the French and Dutch people's disobedience by renaming the EU constitution the Lisbon Treaty, which the EC Vice President Margot Wallström admitted was essentially the same proposal as the old constitution. The thing that the French and the Dutch people democratically rejected was brought back under a new guise. That is cynical and undemocratic. And this time, the people would not be asked to vote on the refashioned constitution because, in the words of the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy, a referendum now would bring Europe into danger. So democracy is dangerous. Democracy, in their eyes, is a threat to what they perceive to be Europe. The people's will is a danger. It's risky. It creates uncertainty. It's something that runs counter to the EU project. In 2008, the Irish people were permitted to vote on the Lisbon Treaty, and they said no. They were then slammed and defamed by Brussels bureaucrats and forced to vote again a year later, and under the pressure of the EU's economic blackmail, which is the only way it can be described, they said yes the second time round. They gave the right answer. The EU is not an expression of the European people's will at any level. On the contrary, it is constituted in direct opposition to the people's will. The people's will is a danger to this project. And this kind of innate hostility of the EU to national sentiment and to democratically elected governments can also be seen in its constant hectoring and reprimanding of the governments of Eastern Europe. In 2006, the elected Prime Minister of Slovakia was instructed by Brussels to challenge political extremism in his country and to repress certain political ways of thinking or risk being in violation of EU regulations. In 2006, the Prime Minister of Poland, the elected Prime Minister of Poland, was forced by Brussels to declare that he is not homophobic or anti-Semitic, and that his government would not bring back the death penalty, regardless of whether the people of Poland wanted him to or not. In 2011, the EU pressured the Hungarian government to rethink its new constitution, which it had just written, actually one of the first democratically written constitutions in Hungary's history. In my mind, it wasn't a particularly nice constitution. It was quite illiberal, but it was written by a democratically elected government. In 2000, when the far-right Freedom Party won 27% of votes in Austria, enough to enter into a coalition government, Brussels imposed diplomatic sanctions on Austria. Brussels said there would be no business as usual so long as the Freedom Party remained in government. The Freedom Party that had just been elected by huge numbers of Austrian people. And Brussels' lecturing of Eastern European governments doesn't only expose the anti-democratic instincts of the EU, it also really gives the lie to the idea that the EU has united the nations of Europe. It's done no such thing. Actually, the EU has nurtured new and deep divisions in Europe, primarily between the apparently civilized west of Europe and the allegedly dark, twisted, weird east of Europe, which must be constantly punished and corrected. The Iron Curtain is back, but in a new PC way. And the Brussels oligarchy's view of democracy as, in Sarkozy's word, dangerous, really became most apparent in 2011. In that year, the EU worked to impose technocratic governments in Greece and Italy, and to import a gang of bankers and bureaucrats to Dublin to keep an eye on the Irish government and to make sure that it enforced the right austerity measures. The EU rode roughshod over democracy in 2011 and installed benign tyrannies in at least 3 countries. And Mario Monti, the unelected technocrat who was charged with running Italy on behalf of Brussels, actually boasted about the aloof regime that he was in charge of. He said, "The absence of political personalities removes any ground for disagreement." That really cuts to the heart of what the EU and its lackeys hate most. politics, personality, colour, debate, disagreement, what people want, what people think. They far prefer the rule of experts, the rule of technocrats. And their fanboys in the media agree with them that technocracy is sometimes preferable to democracy. So in 2011, in that terrible year in European history, which I hope future historians at least will look back on with horror, in 2011, The Guardian published an article headlined, "In Defense of Europe's Technocrats." It argued that temporary technocratic rule may well be acceptable, perhaps necessary, at a time of crisis. Here we have an explicit defense of the destruction of democracy, an open, unabashed argument for the rule of the unelected. And it is coming not from the far right or neo-fascists or the various other people who we are constantly told pose a great threat to democracy in Europe, but it's coming rather from The Guardian, from so-called liberals, from the supposed cosmopolitans of the EU project. Some people argue that the EU is our best guard against the kind of tyranny Europe experienced in the 1930s and 40s. And as they say this, exactly as they say this, Brussels installs unelected leaders, blackmails elected leaders, and describes democracy as a danger. Under the cover of keeping at bay the tyrannies of the past, the EU constructs a new kind of tyranny for today. And these vile attacks on the voters of France and Holland and Ireland, this dictating to the elected governments of Eastern Europe, this enforcement of technocratic rule in Greece and Italy, none of this is accidental or merely a response to particularly tense, crisis-ridden moments in Europe in recent years. No, it is in the very nature of the EU to be suspicious of or plain hostile to the views and attitudes and will of the European people. In fact, the EU has shaped itself precisely around European elites' feeling of exhaustion with the democratic process. The EU is the means through which politics can be done in a new, distant, post-democratic way. And to that end, at the very top of Brussels, we have the dreaded, horrendous European Commission, a body that is emblematic of the EU's feeling of agitation with democracy. This is the executive body responsible for proposing EU legislation, and it is, of course, unelected. It has 28 members, one for each member state, who are nominated by the member states. And you have no more power to get rid of this tiny clique of commissioners that makes laws on your behalf than you have of walking on the moon this evening. You have no control, no direct democratic control over these 28 individuals. They are beyond your reach, yet they construct laws that have an impact on your life. That is fundamentally contradictory to the spirit and the letter of democracy. It goes against the fundamental principle of democracy, which is that a people must consent to the institutions that they are ruled by. The EU doesn't only trash democracy in all those various horrific ways, it restricts liberty too. It is profoundly illiberal at heart. This vast oligarchical entity is unsurprisingly hostile to the idea that people should be free to think whatever they want, to say whatever they want, and to live their lives however they want, so long as they don't harm anyone else. It is hostile to that fundamental principle of liberty. The EU does not trust the people of Europe. It continually passes rules or laws that seek to govern your minds and your lives. It has, for example, told all national governments to restrict speech that incites hatred based on race, sex, religion, or nationality, which is an explicit attack on freedom of speech. It has seriously discussed not only outlawing Holocaust denial, which would be illiberal enough, in my view, but also the denial of various other crimes against humanity, which would massively dent academic freedom and the freedom of historical debate. And its illiberalism is often just mad and petty. So it has banned chocolate candy cigarettes on the basis that they appeal to minors and they could be a gateway to real smoking. It has passed regulations designed to protect what it calls vulnerable consumers, i.e. stupid, ordinary people, including by restricting the advertising of formula milk to new mothers, because in the EU's eyes, new mothers should be breastfeeding, and if they aren't, there's something wrong with them. It wants to ban diabetics from driving. It enforces controls on products that use a certain amount of electricity in an attempt to make us uncaring idiots more eco-friendly, whether we want to be or not. The EU thinks our nationally expressed political will is dangerous, and it also thinks it is dangerous to leave us to our own devices, to let us say what we want, think what we want, buy what we want, behave as we want. This is an institution that is explicitly designed to circumscribe your democratic rights and your everyday ability to govern your life. It goes against what it means to be European. For hundreds of years, through democratic upheavals, revolutions, struggles against religion, struggles for enlightenment, the peoples of Europe have, in various different ways, tried to gain greater control over their nation's political affairs and greater control over their own lives. Those have been the two great goals of pretty much every progressive movement in Europe over the past few hundred years. People having greater control over their national affairs and greater control over their everyday life. The EU undermines both of those things, both democracy and individual liberty. It is against Europe. It is against the history of Europe. It is against us. And as someone who considers himself left-wing, I'm really horrified that lefties are often at the forefront of defending this elitist institution. In my mind, it is an historic black mark on the reputation of the left that it has been the chief cheerleader of an institution that undoes so many of the great gains of radicals and progressives of the past. We must leave the EU in order to defend our democratic clout, in order that we can reassert control and restate our consent to the institutions that govern our lives and write our laws. But we must do more than that. I don't think a Brexit is enough. It sounds a bit too selfish for my liking. We must also encourage and offer solidarity to other European peoples who want to leave the EU, of which there are millions and millions. Too much of the current debate is focused around what will happen to Britain if we leave. My concern is what will happen to the other people of Europe who have to stay in this awful institution. We must fight with them, alongside them, to create a new and a real unity across Europe. A union not of elites who distrust the people, but a union of peoples who have had more than they can take of these backward elites. Thank you.